The needle had been Elena Vasari's only real inheritance, and even that was half a lie, because a needle was worth nothing unless a hand knew how to make it sing. Her mother's hand had known. Elena's hands were still learning, stitch by stitch, in a rented room above a bakery that smelled of yeast in the morning and mice at night. She was 24, and had spent 3 years mending other people's clothes for coins that never quite covered rent, coal, and her younger brother Matteo's medicine. Matteo's lungs had never been strong. The doctor called it consumption, the polite word for slow, expensive dying. Elena called it the reason she hadn't slept past 5 in the morning since she turned 21. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a boy in gray livery who refused to say who had sent him, only that he'd been paid to deliver it, and paid again to leave without answering questions. Elena turned it over before opening it, noting the wax seal, black as a closed eye, pressed with a crest she didn't recognize. A wolf, maybe, or something with wings. She couldn't tell in the dim light of her room. Inside, the handwriting was old-fashioned, looping and precise, the kind taught by tutors who no longer existed. It offered her 100 gold crowns to repair a single garment. 100 crowns was more than Elena would earn in 4 years of hemming skirts, for merchants' wives who complained about her prices while wearing dresses that cost more than her entire wardrobe combined. She read it 3 times, certain she'd misunderstood. The garment, the letter explained, was old and delicate, torn in a way that required a seamstress of exceptional skill and exceptional discretion. She would be collected at dusk. She would work at the estate itself, since the garment could not be moved. She would be paid regardless of whether the repair succeeded. Elena sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought about Matteo coughing in the next room, about the apothecary's unpaid bill folded inside her sewing basket like a curse of its own, about the landlord's increasingly unfriendly knock. 100 crowns would buy medicine that actually worked instead of the diluted syrup she could afford now. It would buy a winter where she didn't have to choose between coal and bread. She should have asked more questions. She knew that even as she packed her kit, wrapped her thimbles and finest needles in a strip of linen, even as she told Matteo she'd be gone a few days for a commission, and watched his thin face brighten with something like pride. "My sister, the finest seamstress in the city," he said once, half joking, half not. Someone had to believe it. It might as well be him. The carriage that came for her at dusk was black lacquered wood with no house crest visible, drawn by horses so still and silent they might have been carved from obsidian. The driver never spoke. Elena climbed in anyway, because 100 crowns did not knock twice, and because desperate people rarely get to choose the shape their rescue takes. The road left the city behind within the hour, winding into hills Elena had never had reason to visit, growing steeper and darker as the carriage climbed. She watched the window until there was nothing left to see but black trees and a moon that seemed too bright, too close, as though it had been hung there specifically to light this one road. The estate appeared without warning, materializing out of fog the way old buildings do in stories meant to frighten children. It was vast. Towers she couldn't count rose against a sky gone the color of a healing bruise. Dozens of windows glowed faintly gold, though Elena saw no one moving behind any of them. The gate swung open before the carriage reached it, hinges silent, which frightened her more than if they'd groaned like every other gate she'd known. An older woman waited at the top of the entrance stairs, dressed severely in dark gray silver hair, pinned with the precision of architecture rather than fashion. She studied Alana the way Alana studied fabric before cutting it, searching for flaws, for strength, for whether the material could bear what was about to be asked of it. "You're younger than the agency described," the woman said, in an accent Alana couldn't place, each word set down like a stone in a wall built to outlast centuries. "Elena Vasari, trained by your mother, who trained under the royal tailor before the fever took her." Her pale eyes didn't blink. "You come recommended, child, by people who do not recommend easily." Alana's mouth went dry. I didn't realize my mother's history was part of the file. We are thorough, the woman said. I am Madame Ilsa. I manage this household. You will address any questions to me directly. You will not wander unescorted. You will not ask about matters beyond the garment you've been brought to repair. She turned, robes whispering against stone floors worn smooth down the center, the way stone wears only after centuries of feet. What if I have questions about the garment itself? Elena asked, hurrying to keep pace. Something crossed Madame Ilsa's face when she glanced back. Pity. Maybe. Or warning. Those, she said, you may ask, though I doubt you'll like the answers. They walked through corridors lined with portraits, whose subjects seemed to track Elena as she passed, through a great hall where a fire burned in a hearth large enough to stand in, though no one tended it, though the room was otherwise empty and cold enough that her breath misted faintly. Everything in this house felt suspended, she thought, waiting, as though the whole estate had been holding its breath for a very long time and had simply forgotten how to exhale. Madame Ilsa stopped before a pair of doors carved with a pattern Elena's eyes kept sliding away from, unable to trace its shape. Beyond this door is the garment, she said, and the man who has worn it for 500 years, though not by choice, and not any longer by breathing. She pressed her palm flat to the wood. I will tell you what I tell everyone brought here, though you are the first in a long while to make it this far. Whatever you find beyond this door, do not scream. Screaming wakes things that are better left resting. Elena's heart hammered so hard she was certain the older woman could hear it. Resting, she repeated. Not dead. No, Madame Ilsa said, and pushed open the doors. Not dead. Merely waiting for hands skilled enough and brave enough to finish what his enemies started 500 years ago. The room beyond the doors was not what Elena expected. She had braced herself for a crypt, for stone and cobwebs and the smell of something long unburied. Instead, she found a chamber that looked like it had been frozen mid-breath in the middle of a wealthy life. A fire burned low in the hearth, though again, no one tended it. Bookshelves climbed the walls, their spines gold-leafed and untouched by dust, which struck Elena as stranger than dust would have been. A writing desk sat angled toward tall windows, an inkwell still open, as though someone had stepped away mid-letter and simply never returned. And in the center of the room, on a raised dais draped in deep burgundy velvet, stood a man. Elena's first thought was that he was a statue. He stood too still, too perfectly composed, one hand resting against the back of a chair he wasn't sitting in, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he'd been listening for something the moment before he stopped moving entirely. He wore a long coat, black shot through, with silver thread and patterns that seemed to shift when Elena's eyes weren't directly on them, and beneath the coat, visible at the collar, and along one torn sleeve, a shirt the color of old bone. It was the sleeve that told her why she was here. The fabric had been rent open from shoulder to elbow, not by wear or accident, but by something violent, a blade perhaps, or claws in the tear had been stitched once already, badly, by hands that had clearly lacked the skill or the patience to do it properly. The old stitches puckered the fabric, straining at threads that looked decades old and about to give entirely. His name, Madame Ilsa said quietly, is Vasilescu. Lord Adrian Vasilescu, of a house that no longer exists anywhere but in old records and older graves. 500 years ago, he was betrayed by his own council on the eve of his wedding. They did not want a human bride diluting a bloodline they considered sacred. They set upon him with blessed iron before the ceremony could be completed, cut this coat from his shoulders as they cut into the flesh beneath it, and left him for what they believed would be his final death. Elena stared at the still, silent figure. He looks alive. He is neither alive nor properly dead, Madame Ilsa said. The blessed iron did not kill him. It cursed him. It bound him into stillness, into waiting, tied to this coat the way a soul is tied to a body. The curse can only be undone by a hand that repairs what the iron destroyed, every torn thread, restored exactly, by someone acting freely, expecting nothing but honest payment for honest work. Her mouth thinned. Every seamstress before you either lacked the skill or grew too frightened to finish. Some fled in the night. One tried to steal the coat itself and was found 3 days later, quite unable to explain what had happened to her hands. Elena's stomach turned cold. "Are you threatening me?" "I am informing you," Madame Ilsa said, not unkindly. "This house does not harm those who deal honestly with it. It has, however, very little patience for those who don't. You will be paid whether you succeed or fail, as promised, but I would advise you, child, to succeed." A man trapped between life and death for 5 centuries does not become more patient with time. He becomes less. Elena approached the dice slowly, sewing kit clutched against her chest like a shield. Up close, the man Adrian, she made herself think. Since a name made him less like a ghost and more like a patient was unsettling in a way she couldn't fully name. His skin held no color at all, pale as the inside of a shell, but his features were sharp and handsome, in a way that felt almost cruel, as though beauty itself had been carved too precisely to be entirely safe. His eyes were closed, dark lashes resting against high cheekbones, and yet Elena had the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched. "Can he hear us?" She whispered. "No one knows," Madame Ilsa admitted. "He has not spoken in 500 years, whether he dreams in that stillness, whether he simply waits in darkness, whether some part of him is aware enough to know that people come and go, and fail him again and again, no one living can say." She gestured to the torn sleeve. "Begin whenever you are ready. There is no clock here. Time does not move the same way in this room as it does beyond these doors." Elena knelt beside the dice and examined the wound in the fabric more closely. The tear was worse than she'd first thought. The old stitches so poorly done, they had actually widened the damage rather than closing it, pulling at threads that were centuries old and unraveling further with every hour that passed. She could see, faintly, that the fabric itself seemed to pulse not with fabric's ordinary give and stretch, but with something closer to a heartbeat, slow and strained, as though the coat itself were struggling to breathe through torn lungs. "This will take days," Elena said, mostly to herself. "The old stitching needs to come out first. All of it. Then I'll need to match thread that hasn't been made in centuries, and match a weave I've never seen before." And she stopped, aware she was talking herself into panic rather than out of it. She looked up at Madame Ilsa. "What happens to him if I fail?" "Nothing," Madame Ilsa said. "That is the cruelty of it. Nothing happens. He simply continues waiting. As he has. As he will, until someone finally gets it right, or until the coat finally rots to nothing and takes whatever remains of him along with it." She turned toward the door. "I will bring food and a bed to the adjoining chamber. Work as long as you need. Rest when your hands shake too badly to be trusted. And Elena," she paused at the threshold, "whatever you do not remove the coat from his shoulders while you work. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, the coat must stay on him, or the binding fails entirely, and there will be no fixing what comes after that." The door closed. Elena was alone, with a 500-year-old curse, a fortune she desperately needed, and a face so still and so beautiful that she found herself, despite every warning, unable to look away from it for longer than she meant to. She worked through the first night by candlelight, picking out the ruined stitches one by one with the tip of her smallest needle, setting each freed thread carefully aside in case its color or weight held some clue she'd need later. It was slow, meticulous work. The kind her mother used to say separated a seamstress from a tailor. A tailor built things quickly, but a seamstress listened to the fabric, let it tell her what it needed instead of forcing her own idea onto it. This fabric needed patience. Under the candlelight, Elena began to see details she'd missed at first glance. The weave was tighter than anything modern looms produced. Each thread impossibly fine, dyed black with something that shimmered faintly silver when the light caught it just right, like a night sky compressed into cloth. Whoever had made this coat had not been an ordinary tailor. They had been an artist, and possibly something more than that, because Elena could have sworn, more than once, that the fabric warmed faintly beneath her fingers, as though it recognized the touch of careful hands after 5 centuries of neglect. She talked to him as she worked, mostly to keep herself from thinking too hard about the wrongness of the situation, a man frozen mid-breath on a dice. A house that seemed to hold itself in suspended silence. A curse that could apparently be undone by nothing more dramatic than good, honest stitching. My brother would love this story, she told the still figure, easing another ruined thread free. He collects tales like this. Cursed lords, sleeping princes, houses that eat their guests. He'd want to know everything what you looked like before, what you were doing on your wedding day, whether you were nervous. She paused, studying the sharp line of his jaw. You don't look like the nervous type. You look like the type who'd insult the priest for taking too long. She could have imagined it. She told herself she'd imagined it, later, when she had time to doubt herself properly. But in that moment, working her needle through centuries-old thread, Elena was almost certain she saw the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, the way a held breath sometimes suggests the laugh that's being suppressed behind it. She dropped her needle. It took her a full minute to convince herself the room was as still as it had been when she'd entered, that the man on the dais hadn't moved, that the flicker she'd seen was nothing more than the candle guttering in a draft she couldn't feel. She picked her needle back up with hands that weren't quite steady and kept working, though she found herself talking less after that, watching more, aware in some primal part of her chest that she was not, perhaps, as alone in this room as Madame Ilsa's explanations had suggested. Madame Ilsa returned the next morning, with bread, cheese, and a pot of tea that never seemed to go cold no matter how many hours passed between refills. She watched Elena work in silence for a while before speaking. "You've made progress," she observed, studying the neat row of removed stitches, the careful pile of old thread set aside for study. Faster than the last 3 who tried. What happened to them? Elena asked, not looking up from her work. One left after a single night, convinced the house was haunted, which, in fairness, it is, though not in the way she feared. One worked for nearly a month before her hands began to tremble too badly to hold a needle nerves, the physician said, though I suspect it was simply the weight of failure pressing down on her, hour after hour, day after day. And one, Madame Ilsa's expression flickered, grew convinced that cutting the coat away entirely, curse or no curse, would free him faster than repairing it properly. She was wrong. Profoundly wrong. Elena's needle paused. What happened to her? She is no longer employed here, Madame Ilsa said, in a tone that made it clear the subject was closed, and Elena, wisely, did not press further. By the second evening, Elena had cleared away the last of the old ruined stitching, and the true scope of the damage revealed itself fully for the first time, a tear that ran nearly the full length of the sleeve, edges frayed and thinned by 500 years of strain, the kind of wound that would have required weeks of careful matching and reweaving under any ordinary circumstance. She sat back on her heels and studied it, exhaustion pulling at the edges of her focus, and found herself once again looking up at the still face above her. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said quietly, "but I want you to know I'm trying. I know it's been 500 years. I know every hour must feel like a year to whatever's left of you in there. I just need you to be patient a little longer. I'm not going to run like the others did. I need this money too badly to run, and besides, she managed a tired, crooked smile. I've never been the type to leave a job half-finished. My mother would come back from the grave just to scold me." The candle guttered again. This time, Alina did not convince herself it was nothing. This time, she was almost certain impossible, as it seemed that something in the room had exhaled. The thread was the hardest part. Alina had matched fabric before that seemed impossible to replicate, had spent whole afternoons in the market hunting for a single dye lot that would pass under a merchant's suspicious eye. But she had never faced anything like the black-silver weave of Adrian Vasilescu's coat. Ordinary black thread looked flat and dead against it, like charcoal laid beside a starlit sky. She tried 7 different spools before she found one, buried at the bottom of her kit, that her mother had given her years ago and told her to save for something that mattered. Alina had never known what that meant until now. She worked the new thread into her needle with hands that had gone steady again, the tremor of exhaustion pushed back by something that felt closer to purpose. Madame Ilse had left her alone for most of the day, and the silence of the room had stopped feeling empty. It felt, instead, like the hush before something. Alina found herself talking again, quietly, the way she had the first night, though this time she didn't second-guess the flicker of a response she thought she saw at the corner of his mouth. My mother used to say a good seamstress could read a person's whole life in the wear of their clothes, she told him, drawing the first new stitch through torn fabric with careful, even tension, where they favored one shoulder over the other, whether they knelt to pray or knelt to work, whether they'd been struck or embraced or simply grown thinner with worry over the years. She glanced up at his still face. I wonder what your coat would tell her. A wedding that never happened. A council that turned on you before the vows were even spoken. She shook her head. I don't understand people who do that. Betray someone for the crime of loving the wrong person. The candle flame bent sideways, though there was no draft. Alina had stopped questioning these small, uncanny movements days ago. She simply noted them, the way she noted a change in weather, and kept working. By the 4th day, the shape of the repair had become clear beneath her hands, not a patch, not a mend that merely covered the wound, but a true restoration, thread by thread, exactly matching the original weave, so that if she succeeded, no one would ever be able to tell the fabric had been torn at all. It was, she realized somewhere in the long hours of the 4th night, the finest work she had ever done in her life, finer than anything she'd made for the merchants' wives who paid her in complaints and small coin, finer than the wedding dress she'd once mended for a bride who never thanked her. She was doing this for Matteo, she reminded herself. For the money. For the medicine that worked instead of the syrup that only pretended to. But somewhere in the candlelit hours, watching a face so still it might have been sculpture, listening to a silence that had somehow stopped feeling lonely, Alina admitted to herself, quietly, that she wanted to finish this for another reason too. She wanted to see his eyes open. She wanted to know if the almost smile she kept catching at the corner of his mouth was real, or only the trick a tired mind plays on itself after too many nights without proper sleep. Madame Ilse found her asleep at the foot of the dais on the 5th morning, needle still loosely held between her fingers, and did not wake her for nearly an hour. When Alina stirred, disoriented and stiff, she found a blanket had been laid over her shoulders sometime in the night, though she had no memory of anyone entering the room. You didn't do that, Alina said slowly, looking at Madame Ilse. No, the older woman agreed, something unreadable passing behind her pale eyes. I did not. Elena looked up at Adrian's still face, at the coat draped over his shoulders, at the long, unbroken length of restored fabric that now covered nearly the entire tear. Only a few inches remained undone, a narrow gap near the shoulder seam where the original wound had been deepest, where the blessed iron had cut closest to whatever passed for a heart in a man suspended between life and death. How close am I? She asked. Madame Ilse studied the work with an expression Elena hadn't seen on her before, something close to hope, carefully guarded, the way a person hopes for things they've been disappointed by too many times to trust fully. Closer, she said, than anyone has ever come. Elena flexed her stiff fingers, picked up her needle, and looked at the small remaining gap in the fabric no wider than the length of her smallest finger, and yet she understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that whatever happened when she closed that final gap would change everything. Not just for the man on the dais. For her. "Then I suppose," she said, mostly to herself, "I'd better finish it properly." She did not begin immediately. She sat back on her heels first, studying the whole of the coat as a painter studies a canvas before the final stroke, checking the tension of every stitch she'd laid, the match of every thread, searching for any flaw that might undo 5 days of careful work in a single careless moment. She found none. Her mother's training had never failed her, not once in 3 years of desperate, hungry work, and it did not fail her now. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, threading the last length of black-silver thread through her needle, "I hope it's what you've been waiting for." She did not know, in that moment, whether she was speaking to Adrian, or to the house itself, or simply to the small, frightened part of herself that had begun, somewhere in the last 5 days, to hope for something she had no right to want. She lowered her needle toward the final gap in the fabric, and began to stitch. Elena's needle passed through the fabric on the final stitch, drew the thread taut, and she reached for her scissors to cut it clean. The way she'd finished 10,000 stitches before this one, without a second thought. The scissors slipped from her fingers before she could close them around the thread. The room did not shake. There was no thunder, no violent burst of light of the kind she half expected from the stories Matteo loved to tell her. Instead, the change came the way dawn comes, quietly, entirely, until the darkness that had seemed permanent simply wasn't there anymore. The candle flames, which had guttered and bent through 6 strange nights, suddenly burned tall and steady, doubling in brightness as though the room itself had exhaled a breath held for 500 years. And the coat, beneath her hands, grew warm. Not the ordinary warmth of fabric near a fire. This was warmth that moved, that pulsed once, twice, in a rhythm Elena recognized with a jolt of pure animal fear as a heartbeat. She scrambled backward off her knees, needle still clutched forgotten in her hand, and watched as the stillness that had defined Adrian Vasilescu for 5 centuries broke apart like ice on a spring river. His chest rose. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary thing, and yet Elena had never in her life seen anything as strange as watching a man breathe for the first time. His fingers, which had rested motionless against the back of the chair for longer than any building in her city had stood, twitched, curled, flexed slowly as though testing whether they still remembered how to hold anything at all. His eyes opened. They were dark, far darker than Elena had expected, though flecked through with something that caught the candlelight and threw it back like scattered stars, and they found her immediately, fixed on her with an intensity that stole whatever breath she had left in her lungs. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena knelt frozen on the cold floor, and Adrian Vasilescu stood on his dais for the first time in 500 years, and looked at her as though she were the only solid thing in a world that had otherwise gone entirely strange around him. "You," he said. His voice was rough, unused, carrying an accent older than any Elena had heard, each word shaped carefully, as though speech itself were a skill he needed to relearn. "You finished it." Elena found her voice somewhere beneath the roaring of her own pulse. "I did." He looked down at his own hands, turned them over slowly, flexed each finger as though counting them, making certain they were real. He touched the restored sleeve, ran his fingertips along the line of Elena's stitching with something that looked, for just a moment, like disbelief. 500 years, he said quietly, not quite to her. 31 attempts, 31 seamstresses, and not one of them he stopped himself, looked up, and for the first time, his sharp carved features softened into something almost human. "What is your name?" "Elena," she managed. "Elena Vasari." "Elena Vasari." He said it slowly, as though tasting each syllable, committing it to a memory that had waited 5 centuries for something worth remembering. He stepped down from the dais, and Elena realized with a fresh jolt of alarm that he moved like water, silent and impossibly fluid, nothing at all like the stillness he'd held only moments before. He crossed the room and knelt before her, which struck her as so profoundly wrong a king, or whatever he was, kneeling before a seamstress that she nearly told him to stop. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked. "I repaired a coat," Elena said, though even as she said it, she understood it was not, could not, be that simple. "You broke a curse that 31 skilled hands failed to break before you," Adrian said. "A curse woven by men who wanted me erased so thoroughly that even death would refuse to take me properly. 500 years I have stood in that stillness, aware, in some dim and terrible way, of every failed attempt, every seamstress who came and went, and left me exactly as broken as they'd found me." His dark eyes held hers, unblinking, ancient. "And then you came, and talked to me as though I could hear you, and worked as though my waiting mattered to you, and you were right on both counts, though you had no way of knowing it." Elena's breath caught. "You could hear me. All of it. Every word he said, every night. I heard you talk about your brother, about your mother's training, about wanting to see my eyes open, though I don't think you meant for me to hear that particular thought. Something that might have been the ghost of amusement crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. I have had 500 years to think about what I would say to whoever finally freed me. I find, now that the moment has come, that I have forgotten every word of it." Madame Ilsa's voice cut through the charged silence like a blade. "My lord." She stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears, actual tears. The first weakness Elena had seen in her since arriving, tracking down her composed face. Adrian rose to his feet, turned toward her, and whatever ancient formality existed between them broke entirely as Madame Ilsa crossed the room and embraced him without ceremony, without hesitation. The way a mother embraces a son, returned from a war everyone believed had killed him. "You waited," Adrian said quietly, into her hair. 500 years, and you never once stopped waiting. "Someone had to," Madame Ilsa said, voice thick. "It was never going to be anyone but me." The house woke with him. Elena noticed it within the hour. Servants she hadn't known existed suddenly moving through corridors that had felt abandoned only a day before. Fires lit in hearths across the estate without visible hands to light them. The low murmur of voices in rooms that had stood silent and dustless for 5 centuries. Madame Ilsa explained, once she'd composed herself, that the entire household had been bound to Adrian's curse, suspended alongside him, waiting the way he had waited, unable to age or leave or properly live until the coat was made whole again. "You didn't just free one man," Madame Ilsa told her, guiding Elena to a chamber with a proper bed and a proper fire, the first true comfort she'd been offered since arriving. "You freed an entire house. Do you understand now why 31 failures mattered so much? Every one of them was a year, sometimes a decade, of continued waiting for everyone bound within these walls." Elena sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, still faintly trembling from the shock of it all. "I only meant to repair a coat for 100 crowns, she said. "I didn't know I was carrying that much weight into the room with me. Few people who change the world know it while they're doing it," Madame Ilsa said, not unkindly. "Rest now. Lord Vasilescu will want to speak with you properly once he's had time to remember how to be a man instead of a memory." Sleep did not come easily. Elena lay in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house coming back to life around her, and thought about Matteo, about the 100 crowns waiting to be paid, about the strange ache in her chest that had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with the way Adrian Vasilescu had looked at her, kneeling on the floor, as though she were the first real thing he'd seen in half a millennium. He came to find her the next morning, dressed now in clothes that fit the current century, rather than the one he'd been frozen in, though he still wore the repaired coat over his shoulders, as though he couldn't quite bring himself to remove it yet. In daylight, properly dressed, properly alive, he was even more striking than Elena had let herself notice the night before, sharp-boned and pale, dark hair falling loose across a brow that seemed built for authority. Dark eyes that studied her now with none of the desperate hunger of a man freshly woken. But something quieter, more careful, like a man handling something breakable. "I owe you an explanation," he said, taking the seat across from her at the small table Madame Ilse had set with breakfast neither of them touched. "And an apology for the danger I've likely put you in simply by finishing what you finished." Elena's stomach tightened. Danger? What kind of danger? The council that betrayed me 500 years ago did not vanish when I was cursed, Adrian said. Their bloodlines continued. Their descendants still hold power in circles you have never had reason to know exist, and they have spent 5 centuries believing me permanently erased, out of their way, no longer a threat to the purity of a line they consider sacred. His jaw tightened. The moment word spreads that the curse has broken, and word will spread. Elena, these things always do. They will understand exactly what that means, and they will understand exactly who broke it. They'll come after me, Elena said slowly, the realization settling into her chest like a stone. I will not allow that, Adrian said, with a quiet, absolute certainty that startled her. Whatever else changes, whatever else happens between us, I owe you a debt 500 years deep, and I intend to honor it fully. You will remain here, under this house's protection, for as long as the danger persists. Your brother as well, if you'll permit me to send for him. I have physicians in this house more skilled than anything your city's apothecaries can offer. His illness need not remain a burden you carry alone. Elena's breath caught at the mention of Matteo, at the casual, staggering generosity of the offer. You don't even know him. I know you, Adrian said simply. 5 nights of listening to a woman talk to a man she believed couldn't hear her taught me more about her heart than most people learn about each other in years of ordinary conversation. You spoke of your brother every single night, Elena. Not once with resentment for the burden, only with love and fear, and a fierce, stubborn hope that refused to break no matter how heavy the weight became. He held her gaze steadily. I would like to ease that weight, if you'll allow it. Not as payment. As a debt, I intend to spend the rest of whatever life I have left repaying. Elena's eyes stung, unexpectedly, and she looked down at her untouched breakfast, rather than let him see it. You don't owe me anything beyond the 100 crowns we agreed on. I owe you everything, Adrian said quietly. You simply haven't let yourself understand that yet. She let him send the physician anyway, 3 days later. Once the initial shock of the house's awakening had settled into something like a routine, she did not, at first, let herself hope that Matteo's illness could be anything but the slow, grinding sentence it had always been. Hope, in Elena's experience, was a luxury poor people paid for dearly when it failed them. But she wrote to her brother that night, regardless, telling him only that her commission had gone well, that she'd been offered further work, that he should trust the strangers who came to collect him and bring him somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere his lungs might finally be given a fair chance to heal. She did not yet know how to explain the rest of it. Not the curse. Not the coat. Not the man who watched her now across every meal with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in years, like something other than a pair of tired, capable hands. Matteo arrived 8 days later, thinner and paler than Elena remembered, even from her last visit home, but alive, and awed, nearly speechless by the estate that had swallowed his sister whole. He took to Madame Ilse immediately, in the way of children and the very ill, who often see clearly what adults have trained themselves to doubt, and to Elena's quiet relief, he took to Adrian too, peppering him with the exact questions Elena had once joked he would ask. Were you scared? Matteo demanded, on his second evening in the house, curled in a chair by the library fire, with a blanket Elena suspected Adrian had ordered specifically for him. Being stuck like that, not able to move or talk or anything. For 500 years. Adrian considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to give everything Matteo asked him, which Elena had noticed and quietly treasured. "I was not scared in the way you mean," he said. "Fear requires the belief that something might still happen to you. I had stopped believing anything would happen to me at all. What I felt was closer to grief, watching centuries pass through a window I couldn't open, understanding that everyone I had ever loved was already dust, and would remain dust, and that I would remain exactly as I was, forever, unless something changed, that I had no power to change myself." "And then, Elena fixed your coat," Matteo said, with the simple, devastating logic of a boy who had spent most of his short life watching his sister fix things other people had given up on. "And then your sister fixed my coat," Adrian agreed, and the look he gave Elena across the fire made something in her chest tighten pleasantly, uncomfortably, in a way she still hadn't found the words for. The physician confirmed, within the week, what Elena had barely allowed herself to hope, that Matteo's illness, caught properly and treated with resources far beyond anything the city's apothecaries could offer, was not the certain death sentence she'd spent years quietly grieving in advance. Not cured, the physician cautioned carefully, but manageable, survivable, with time and proper care and a warmth that the drafty room above the bakery had never been able to provide. Elena wept, that night, alone in her chamber, the way she hadn't allowed herself to weep in years, not from grief, for once, but from the strange, disorienting relief of a burden finally set down after being carried so long she'd forgotten what her shoulders felt like without it. Adrian found her there. He didn't ask permission to sit beside her on the small bench near the window, and Elena found she didn't want him to. "You've spent your whole adult life keeping him alive," Adrian said quietly, watching her rather than the garden beyond the glass, "working yourself past exhaustion, denying yourself things you needed so he could have things he needed more. That kind of love leaves marks, Elena, even when it succeeds. Especially when it succeeds, sometimes, because you never get the chance to grieve the years you lost to fear." "How do you know so much about it?" Elena asked, wiping at her eyes, embarrassed to be witnessed this way. "Because I loved someone once the way you love your brother," Adrian said. Fiercely, completely, willing to burn down anything that threatened her, including, in the end, my own counsel's approval. His expression went distant, the ancient weight of 500 years settling visibly across his features. Her name was Anna. She was a healer in the village below this estate. Human, unremarkable by my counsel's narrow standards, and utterly remarkable by every standard that mattered. I loved her for 3 years before they discovered it. They gave me a choice: renounce her, or renounce my house entirely. Elena's breath caught. "What did you choose?" "Her," Adrian said simply. "I chose her, without hesitation, and told my counsel exactly what I thought of a bloodline so fragile it could be threatened by something as harmless as love. I intended to marry her within the month, to leave this house and this title behind entirely if that was the price of keeping her." His jaw tightened. "They did not give me the chance. They came for me the night before the wedding, and whatever happened to Anna after that, I have never been able to learn. 500 years, Elena, and I still do not know if she lived a full life believing I had abandoned her, or if they silenced her too, to keep their secret clean." Elena reached for his hand without entirely deciding to, and felt him go still at the contact, the way a man goes still when he's forgotten, across 5 centuries of frozen isolation, what warmth feels like against his skin. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's a grief with no bottom to it. Not knowing." "It was," Adrian agreed, turning his hand to hold hers properly. "For 500 years, it was the only thing I had left to feel." His dark eyes found hers, steady and searching, and then a seamstress with tired hands and a stubborn heart sat beside my stillness and talked to me as though I mattered, and reminded me, before I even understood what she was doing, that grief was not, in fact, the only thing left in me capable of feeling. Elena did not pull her hand away. Outside the window, the garden had begun to bloom in a way Madame Ilsa insisted it hadn't managed in centuries, as though the entire estate had simply been waiting, the way its lord had been waiting, for something worth growing toward again. Neither of them spoke of what the moment meant. It felt too large, too new, too fragile to survive being named too soon. And so they simply sat together in the firelight, her hand in his, and let the silence hold what neither of them was ready yet to say aloud. The warning came in the form of a dead crow, left deliberately on the estate's front step 3 weeks later, its throat cut in a pattern Madame Ilsa recognized immediately and refused, at first, to explain to Elena. "It's the council's mark," Adrian said instead, when Alana pressed him, his voice gone flat and cold in a way she hadn't heard from him since the morning he'd woken. "The Dragonescu line, descendants of the men who cursed me. They've heard the rumors then, and wanted us to know they've heard them." "What does it mean?" Alana asked, though some instinctive part of her already understood she wouldn't like the answer. "It means they know I've woken," Adrian said, "and it means they'll want to finish what they started 500 years ago, before word spreads further and I have time to rebuild alliances they'd rather I didn't have." He looked at her with an expression that had gone carefully, deliberately calm, the way a man goes calm when panic would serve no one. "It also means they'll want to know who broke the curse. A seamstress with no house, no title, no protection beyond what I can offer her, is exactly the kind of loose thread a frightened old bloodline likes to pull." Alina's pulse spiked. "Matteo is safe," Adrian said immediately. "This house is warded more thoroughly than you understand, and will remain so. But I would be lying to you if I said the danger wasn't real, or that I could promise you perfect safety simply by wishing it so." He reached for her hands, held them steady between his own, cool and certain. "I can offer you a choice, though, one I should have offered from the very first morning. You can remain here, under this house's full protection, bound to nothing but the roof over your head and your brother's care. Or you can bind yourself to me formally, by the old rights of this house, which would extend every protection this bloodline can offer directly to you, protection the Dragonescu line would think 3 times before testing." "Bind myself to you," Alana repeated slowly. "You mean marry you?" "I mean exactly that," Adrian said, and for the first time since he'd woken, Elena saw something like uncertainty cross his ancient composed features. "I understand the weight of what I'm asking. You came here for 100 crowns and a chance to save your brother, not to inherit a war 5 centuries old, and I would never fault you for choosing safety over obligation to a man you've known for less than a month." His thumb traced absently along her knuckles. "But I would be dishonest if I told you the offer comes from duty alone. I have had 500 years to forget what it felt like to want anything beyond the simple mercy of an ending. You reminded me, Elena, every single night you sat beside me and talked as though I still mattered, and I do not think I want to spend whatever years remain to me forgetting that again." Elena's throat tightened. She thought of the 100 crowns, still unpaid, still theoretically the entire point of everything that had happened since that letter arrived on a Tuesday. She thought of Matteo, sleeping soundly for the first time in years down the hall, his lungs finally given a fighting chance. She thought of 5 nights spent talking to a man she'd believed couldn't hear her, and the strange, undeniable comfort she'd felt doing it, as though some part of her had recognized, before her conscious mind caught up, that she wasn't speaking into silence at all. "This isn't about the money anymore," she said slowly, testing the truth of the words as she spoke them. "I stopped thinking about the 100 crowns somewhere around the 3rd night, if I'm honest. I kept working because I wanted to see you wake up. I kept talking because some part of me already she stopped, cheeks warming, and made herself finish it anyway. Because Adrian Vasilescu had waited 500 years for honesty, and she wasn't about to be the first person in his life to withhold it from him now. Some part of me already cared what happened to you, long before I understood why. Adrian's hand tightened around hers. Elena, but I need you to understand something first, she continued, before her courage could fail her. I won't be bound to you out of fear of the Dragonescu line. If I do this, it has to be because I want it, freely, the same way I finished that coat freely, expecting nothing but honest payment for honest work. If you're only offering because you're afraid for me, tell me now, and I'll stay anyway, and we'll face whatever comes without needing a ceremony to make it real. Something in Adrian's ancient, careful composure finally broke, gently, like ice giving way to spring water beneath it. I am afraid for you, he admitted, but that is not why I'm asking. And I think you already know it isn't. He lifted her hand, pressed his lips to her knuckles, the first true tenderness he'd allowed himself since waking. I am asking because I love you, Elena Vasari. And I suspect I have loved you since the third night, when you told a man you believed couldn't hear you, that you hoped. Whatever happened, it was what he'd been waiting for. Elena's eyes filled, unexpectedly, entirely. It was, she whispered. It was exactly what you'd been waiting for. The binding ceremony took place 3 nights later, under a moon Madame Ilsa insisted was auspicious, in the same great hall where Elena had first walked past a fire no one tended. The room had transformed entirely since that first night, warm now, alive, crowded with members of the household Elena hadn't known existed during those first strange days. All of them watching her with open curiosity, and to her surprise, open warmth. Madame Ilsa had dressed her in deep midnight blue, the fabric so fine Elena kept catching herself checking the seams out of old habit, searching for flaws that simply weren't there. A silver circlet rested against her dark hair, light enough that she barely felt its weight, though she was aware, constantly, of what it represented. You look like you belong here, Matteo told her, beaming from his seat near the front. Color returned to his cheeks in a way that still caught in Elena's throat every time she looked at him properly. I feel like I'm playing dress-up, Elena admitted, smoothing the skirt with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling since the ceremony's hour had been set. You're not, Madame Ilsa said firmly, appearing at her elbow the way she always seemed to, precisely when needed. You broke a curse 31 skilled women failed to break before you. You earned every thread of that dress, child, and every ounce of respect this house is about to show you. Lift your chin. Let them see it. Adrian waited at the head of the hall, dressed in dark formal clothes that made him look every inch the lord he'd been before the curse took him. The repaired coat draped over his shoulders even now, as though he intended to wear the proof of what she'd done for him for the rest of whatever centuries remained to them both. His dark eyes found hers the moment she entered, and held there, steady and warm, through the entire long walk down the hall. The rites themselves were old, spoken partly in a language Elena didn't recognize, partly in words plain enough for her to understand and repeat. She promised herself to him freely, without coercion, expecting nothing beyond what he chose to give of his own will. He promised the same in return, and when Madame Ilsa pressed a small blade to each of their palms and guided their joined hands together, Alana felt something pass between them that was warmer than blood, older than the ceremony itself, settling into her chest like a second heartbeat that hadn't been there a moment before. By blood given and vows spoken, Madame Ilsa intoned, her voice carrying easily through the hushed hall. Let this house recognize its lady, and let every protection this bloodline commands stand between her and any hand raised against her, from this night until the ending of the world. She looked between them both, something fierce and proud in her ancient eyes. I pronounce you bound, husband and wife, lord and lady of this house. The hall erupted into sound Elena hadn't expected, cheering, genuine and warm, from a household that had waited 5 centuries for exactly this moment, for their lord to have someone worth waking for. Adrian pulled her close, and when he kissed her, gently, carefully, as though she were something he still couldn't quite believe was real, Elena felt the last of her fear dissolve into something that felt, for the first time in years, entirely like hope. The Dragonescu response came 4 days later, and it came for blood. Elena woke to shouting in the courtyard, to the clash of steel against something that wasn't quite steel, to Madame Ilsa's voice raised in a fury Elena had never heard from her before. She threw on the nearest robe and ran, heart-hammering, toward the sound, and found the courtyard lit by torches, and worse, a dozen figures in dark riding clothes, blades drawn, facing off against a household that had woken from 5 centuries of stillness only weeks before, and was not, Elena realized, with cold horror, remotely prepared for a proper fight. Adrian stood at the center of it, unarmed, his expression carved from something colder than Elena had ever seen on him. "You are trespassing on warded ground," he said, his voice carrying without needing to be raised. "Leave now, and I will consider the debt between our houses unchanged. Stay, and you will learn exactly how patient 500 years of injustice has made me." The figure at the head of the riders, an older man with silver hair and eyes like winter ice, unmistakably descended from whatever council had cursed Adrian centuries before, laughed, sharp and humorless. "The debt was never between our houses, Vasilescu. It was between your bloodline and purity itself, and it remains unpaid so long as you draw breath beside a human bride." His gaze slid to Elena, standing frozen in the courtyard doorway. Ah, there she is. The seamstress who couldn't leave well enough alone. Elena's blood ran cold, but she made herself step forward instead of back, made herself stand beside Adrian rather than retreat behind him. "I finished honest work for honest payment," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If that's a crime in your eyes, then I suppose I'm guilty of it, and I'd do it again." The silver-haired man's smile thinned. Brave words for a woman with no protection beyond a wedding vow, 3 centuries too late to matter. He raised a hand, and the riders behind him shifted forward as one, blades catching torchlight. "We came to finish what should have ended 500 years ago, before your bride's clever hands undid a century of careful containment." Adrian's hand found Elena's, cool and steady despite the danger closing around them both. "Then it seems," he said quietly, "we have nothing left to discuss." And the courtyard, which had been merely tense a moment before, broke suddenly into motion, torches and steel and voices raised. The household's long dormant strength finally called on to defend the lord and lady they had waited 5 centuries to protect. Elena had never seen violence like this, had never imagined she'd stand in the center of it, but there was no time for fear to take proper hold before instinct simply carried her, dragging her backward toward the hall's doorway as steel met steel around her, and the household's long, still strength poured out in a fury 500 years in the making. Madame Ilsa fought like something out of the old stories Matteo loved, faster than Elena's eyes could properly track, and beside her, servants Elena had shared meals with only weeks before moved with a speed and ferocity that made clear exactly what kind of house she had married into. Adrian fought at the center of it, and watching him, Elena understood for the first time the full weight of what 500 years of restrained fury looked like once it was finally, fully unleashed. He moved like something not entirely bound by the same rules as the men attacking him, and one by one, the Dragonescu riders fell back, wounded or fleeing, until only their silver-haired leader remained, blade raised, breathing hard, staring at Adrian with an expression that had curdled from confidence into something closer to fear. "This isn't finished," the man spat, retreating toward his horse. "It is for tonight," Adrian said, his voice carrying easily across the ruined courtyard. "Return again, and I promise you, it will finish considerably more permanently." The rider fled. The courtyard fell into a ragged, exhausted silence, broken only by the crackle of dropped torches and the low moans of the wounded being gathered by household members already moving to help. Elena, still frozen by the hall doorway, only realized she'd been struck when she reached up to push her hair back, and her fingers came away wet and dark. The world tilted. She heard Adrian's voice, distant and sharp with a fear she'd never heard from him before, felt his arms catch her before her knees fully gave out beneath her. Elena. His voice cracked around her name in a way 5 centuries of composure had never allowed before. Elena, look at me. I'm fine, she tried to say, though the words came out slurred, distant, wrong. It's just a scratch. It is not just a scratch, Adrian said, and Elena had never heard anything like the raw terror in his voice, not even in the stories Madame Ilsa had told her about the night the curse first took him. He lifted her carefully, carried her through the hall, while shouting orders Elena's fading awareness couldn't quite follow, and the last thing she registered clearly was Madame Ilsa's face, pale and grim, appearing above her, murmuring words in that old, careful language Elena still didn't understand. She woke, hours or days later, she couldn't tell which, in the bed she'd shared with Adrian since the binding ceremony, her head bandaged, her body aching in a way that suggested the wound had been worse than she'd let herself believe in the courtyard's chaos. Adrian sat beside her, unmoving, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that told her he hadn't left that chair in however long she'd been unconscious. "You're awake," he said, and the relief in his voice broke something open in Elena's chest. "How bad was it?" she asked, her voice rough. "Bad enough that I understood, for the first time since I woke, exactly what it would mean to lose you," Adrian said quietly. 500 years of stillness never frightened me the way those hours did, watching Madame Ilsa work to save you, uncertain whether 5 centuries of debt would end with me losing the only thing I'd found worth living for. He took her hand, pressed it, against his chest, where Elena could feel, faintly, the steady rhythm of a heart that had only recently remembered how to beat at all. "I cannot lose you, Elena. I have already lost one woman I loved to a council that valued bloodline purity over human life. I will not survive losing another." Elena's fingers tightened around his. "You won't," she said. "I didn't survive years of scraping by on nothing. Didn't spend 5 nights talking to a man I thought couldn't hear me, just to lose my nerve over one bad scratch from a bitter old man with a grudge 3 centuries too old to matter." Something that might have been a laugh, rough with lingering fear, escaped Adrian's throat. "I love you," he said, as though the words still felt new in his mouth. "I loved you before I understood what loving someone again would cost me to risk. I love you enough now to spend whatever years remain to me making certain no one ever comes close to hurting you again." "Centuries," Elena corrected softly, drawing him down beside her despite the ache in her side. "You said years. I think you meant centuries." Adrian's dark eyes softened, something like wonder breaking through the last of his fear. "Centuries," he agreed. "I meant centuries." Madame Ilsa checked on her twice more that night, satisfied at last that the wound had closed cleanly. She left a tray of tea neither of them touched, and a look on her face, when she paused at the door, that Elena recognized from the very first night she'd arrived not pity this time, but relief. The particular relief of a woman who had waited 5 centuries to see her house properly, finally, safely full again. Matteo visited the next morning, pale with worry until he saw Elena sitting upright, and threw himself against her side with a fierceness that pulled a startled laugh from her despite the lingering ache. "You scared me," he accused, muffled against her shoulder. "Don't do that again." "I'll do my best," Elena promised, resting her hand against his hair, and meant it as fully as she had ever meant anything in her life. The weeks that followed settled into something Elena had never dared imagine for herself, not merely safety, though safety alone would have been more than she'd ever hoped for, but a life. Matteo grew stronger by the day, under the physician's careful attention, color returning to cheeks that had been pale and hollow for as long as Elena could remember, laughter returning to a boy who'd spent too many years watching his sister exhaust herself to keep him alive. He took to exploring the estate's endless corridors with an energy Elena hadn't seen from him since before the illness first took hold, trailing after Madame Ilsa with questions about the house's history that the older woman, to Elena's quiet delight, seemed to genuinely enjoy answering. Adrian sent word through channels Elena didn't fully understand to the scattered remnants of allies his house had once commanded. Old debts called in, old alliances quietly reforged. The Dragonescu line did not return, not that season, not the one after, though Adrian never let his guard fully down, never stopped watching the horizon with the wary patience of a man who understood that 5 centuries of grievance rarely died as easily as a single failed raid might suggest. But the estate, slowly, unmistakably, stopped feeling like a place under siege, and started feeling, for the first time since the curse first took hold, like a home. Elena kept sewing. She hadn't expected to, hadn't imagined a lady of the house would be permitted, let alone encouraged, to keep working with her hands, but Adrian had laughed, genuinely and warmly, the first time she'd raised the concern. "You broke a 500-year curse with those hands," he told her, catching her fingers and pressing a kiss to each calloused knuckle in turn. "I would not dream of asking you to set them aside. Sew whatever you wish, Elena. Teach the household seamstresses your mother's methods, if you'd like. This house has never had anything half so valuable as what you carry in your fingertips, and I intend to make certain the whole of it knows that." She did eventually take on students, young women from the village below the estate who'd heard, in the whispered way such stories always traveled, about the seamstress who had married a lord and broken a curse 31 others had failed to break. Elena taught them her mother's patience, the old lessons about listening to fabric instead of forcing it, and found to her surprise, that teaching filled something in her she hadn't known was empty, some quiet ache left over from years of working alone, unseen, unthanked, simply to keep herself and Matteo alive one more season. One evening, nearly a year after the night she'd first climbed into a black carriage bound for an estate she'd never heard of, Elena stood in the garden that Madame Ilsa still insisted had never bloomed so fully in all the centuries she'd tended it, watching the sun set gold and crimson over towers that no longer felt haunted, only old, only home. Adrian found her there, as he often did, drawn by whatever quiet bond had settled between them since the binding ceremony, a thread every bit as real. Elena had come to understand as any she'd ever sewn by hand. "You're thinking about something," he observed, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of a year's worth of evenings, spent exactly this way. "I'm thinking about the letter," Elena admitted. "The one that started all of this. I keep it, you know. In my sewing kit, folded behind my finest needles. I read it again sometimes, just to remind myself how close I came to refusing it. If Matteo hadn't been so sick that winter, if the 100 crowns hadn't mattered quite so desperately, I might have thrown it in the fire and never known any of this existed." Adrian's thumb traced slow circles against her hand. "Do you regret how it began? The desperation of it?" Elena considered the question seriously. "No," she said, finally. "I regret that Matteo was ever sick enough to make me that desperate. But I don't regret the letter, or the carriage, or 5 nights spent talking to a man I thought couldn't hear me." She turned to face him fully, the last of the sunset catching golden eyes that had once seemed carved from stone and now looked, to her, like the warmest thing she'd ever known. "I think, somehow, all of that desperation led exactly where I was always meant to end up." 500 years I waited, Adrian said quietly, not knowing what I was waiting for. Only that 31 attempts had failed, and I could not, for reasons I didn't understand until you arrived, quite believe the 32nd would fail as well. He lifted her hand, pressed his lips to it. I waited 500 years for your hands, Elena Vasari. I would wait 500 more, gladly, if it meant finding you again at the end of it. You won't have to, Elena said, and meant it with everything the last year had taught her to believe. I'm not going anywhere. Not for 100 crowns, not for 100 curses, not for anything this world or the next has left to throw at us. Behind them, the estate's windows glowed gold against the deepening evening, alive now in every corridor, every hearth, every room that had waited 5 centuries in patient, hopeful stillness for exactly this ending. Years passed the way Elena had once believed only happened in stories gently, gratefully, one bloomed season folding into the next. Matteo grew into a young man with strong lungs and a scholar's endless curiosity, eventually apprenticing under the estate's physician, determined to give other desperate families the mercy Adrian's house had given his own. Elena's school of seamstresses grew too, girls from the village and beyond learning patience and precision at the hands of a woman the old stories had already begun to call, quietly, reverently, the seamstress who stitched a curse closed by accident and found a 500-year love waiting on the other side of the thread. Adrian never removed the coat. Not truly. Not even decades later when its restoration had long since become simply part of the fabric rather than a visible seam. He wore it the way Elena had learned he wore everything meaningful in his long life quietly, faithfully, a reminder worn close rather than a wound left open. Some evenings, still, Elena would catch him watching her work by candlelight, needle moving steady through cloth, and see in his ancient, patient eyes the exact same wonder he'd shown her the very first night he opened them. "What are you thinking?" she'd ask, the way she always did. And he would smile, the same quiet smile she'd first imagined into a dead man's stillness, and tell her the same answer every time. 500 years of loneliness folded into 4 simple words that never once grew old between them, that you were worth waiting for. Madame Ilsa remained at the estate through it all, her silver hair never quite softening into anything less severe, her devotion never once wavering, standing witness to a house that had learned, finally, to breathe. She liked to tell the newer servants on quiet evenings that she had waited 500 years to see her lord smile the way he smiled now, and that she intended to spend however many centuries remained making certain nothing ever dimmed it again. Elena kept the original letter still, folded behind her finest needles, a small, worn reminder of the desperate Tuesday that had changed everything. She never burned it, though she'd long since stopped needing to reread it to remember. Some threads, she'd learned, were meant to be kept exactly as they were sewn, imperfect at the start, and stronger for it in the end.